Hello and welcome back to Bedtime Stories with Nonna Angie at the Davenport Public Library. I am so glad that you have stuck with us for this book. We are reading The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane by Kate DeCamillo. The illustrations are by Bagram Iba Tulane and it's published by Candlewick Press, who has given us permissions to read this together. And here's Edward as he started out. There he is in his fine suit. And if you remember, he has had some pretty serious adventures. He left his home with Abilene and ended up getting thrown overboard. He was rescued out of the sea by a fisherman and his wife. From there, he ended up in the dump. And a dog named Lucy rescued him and brought him home. And he spent some time traveling around the country and living on a train. And then his latest adventure, although I don't know how much of an adventure it was, he was found by an old woman who nailed him up as a scarecrow or a scare rabbit. So when we left him, a little boy had just come and pulled him off of his scarecrow perch. Let's see what it says. But when the last nail was out and he fell forward into Bryce's arms, the rabbit felt a rush of relief, and the feeling of relief was soon followed by one of joy. Perhaps, he thought, it is not too late after all for me to be saved. So there's chapter 17. I don't know the significance of that little shack yet, but I think we'll find out. Bryce slung Edward over his shoulder and he started to walk. I'll come to get you for Sarah Ruth, Bryce said. You don't know Sarah Ruth. She's my sister. She's sick. She had a baby doll made out of china. She loved that baby doll. But he broke it. He broke it. He was drunk and he stepped on that baby's head and smashed it into 100 million pieces. Them pieces were so small. I couldn't make them go back together. I couldn't. I tried and I tried. At this point in the story, Bryce stopped walking and shook his head and wiped at his nose with the back of his hand. Sarah Ruth ain't had nothing to play with since. He won't buy her nothing. He says she don't need nothing. He says she don't need nothing because she ain't gonna live. But he don't know. Bryce started to walk again. He don't know, he said. Who he was not clear to Edward. What was clear was that he was being taken to a child to make up for the loss of a doll. A doll. How Edward loathed dolls, and to be thought of as a likely replacement for a doll offended him. But still, he had to admit, it was a highly preferable alternative to hanging by his ears from a post. The house in which Bryce and Sarah Ruth lived was so small and crooked that Edward did not believe at first that it was a house. He mistook it instead for a chicken coop. Inside were 2 beds and a kerosene lamp and not much else. Bryce laid Edward at the foot of one of the beds and then lit the lamp. Sarah, Bryce whispered. Sarah Ruth, you got to wake up now, honey. I brung you something. He took a harmonica out of his pocket and he played the beginning of a simple melody. The little girl sat up in her bed and she immediately started to cough. Bryce put his hand on her back. That's all right, he told her. That's okay. She was young, maybe 4 years old, and she had white blonde hair, and even in the poor light of the lamp, Edward could see that her eyes were the same gold-flecked brown as Bryce's. That's right, said Bryce. You go on ahead and cough. Sarah Ruth obliged him. She coughed and she coughed and she coughed. On the wall of the cabin, the kerosene light cast her trembling shadow, hunched over and small. The coughing was the saddest sound that Edward had ever heard, sadder even than the mournful call of the whippoorwill. Finally, Sarah Ruth stopped. Bryce said, You want to see what I brung you? Sarah Ruth nodded. You gotta close your eyes. The girl closed her eyes. Bryce picked up Edward and held him so that he was standing straight like a soldier at the end of the bed. All right now, you can open them. Sarah Ruth opened her eyes, and Bryce moved Edward's china legs and china arms so it looks as if so it looked as if he were dancing. Sarah Ruth laughed and clapped her hands. Rabbit, she said. He's for you, honey, said Bryce. Sarah Ruth looked first at Edward and then at Bryce and then back at Edward again, her eyes wide and disbelieving. He's yours. Mine? Sarah Ruth, Edward was soon to discover, rarely said more than one word at a time. Words, at least several of them strung together, made her cough. She limited herself. She said only what needed to be said. Yours, said Bryce. I got him special for you. This knowledge provoked another fit of coughing in Sarah Ruth, and she hunched over again. When the fit was done, she uncurled herself and held out her arms. That's right, said Bryce, and he handed Edward to her. Baby, said Sarah Ruth, and she rocked Edward back and forth and stared down at him and smiled. Never in his life had Edward been cradled like a baby. Abilene had not done it, nor had Nellie, and most certainly Bull had not. It was a singular sensation to be held so gently and yet so fiercely, and to be stared down at with so much love. Edward felt the whole of his china body flood with warmth. You going to give him a name, honey? Bryce asked. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth without taking her eyes off Edward. Jangles, huh? Well, that's a good name. I like that name. Bryce patted Sarah Ruth on the head. She continued to stare down at Edward. Hush, she said to Edward as she rocked him back and forth. From the minute I first seen him, said Bryce, I knew he belonged to you. I said to myself, that rabbit is for Sarah Ruth, for sure. Jangles, murmured Sarah Ruth. And there's a picture of Sarah Ruth and Bryce and Jangles. Jangles, a.k.a. Edward. Outside the cabin, thunder cracked, and then came the sound of rain falling on the tin roof. Sarah rocked Edward back and forth, and Bryce took out his harmonica and started to play, making his song, Keep Rhythm with the Rain. Oh, that sounds a lot better than being a scarecrow. Okay, here's chapter 18. Looks like a lot of buttons. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah was sitting up in bed, coughing, and the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, I ain't never. It's a baby doll, said Bryce. Don't look like no baby doll to me. Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of china dolls. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth between coughs. She held out her arm. He's hers, said Bryce. He belongs to her. The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. It don't matter anyway, said the father. It don't make no difference, none of it. It does so matter, said Bruce. Don't you sass me, said the father, and he raised his hand and he slapped Bryce across the mouth, and then he turned and left the house. You ain't got to worry about him, said Bryce to Edward. He ain't nothing but a bully, and besides, he don't hardly ever come home. Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent her day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box filled with buttons. Pretty, she said to Edward as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them in different patterns. Sometimes when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one or the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found it intrusive, clinging behavior of this very sort annoying. Normally, Edward would have found this intrusive, clinging sort of behavior very annoying, but there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. You eat that all up, honey. Let me hold Jangle, said Bryce. Him and me, we got a surprise for you. Bryce took Edward off in a corner of the room, and with his pocket knife he cut off links of twine, and he tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of woods. See, all day I've been thinking about it, Bryce said. What we're going to do here is make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance her around the room. You eating that biscuit? Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. Uh-huh, said Sarah Ruth. You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you. Bryce stood up. Close your eyes, he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, Okay, you can open them now. Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. Dance, Jangles, said Bryce, and then, moving the strings with the sticks in one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway, and the whole while, at the same time with his other hand, he held onto his harmonica and he played a bright and lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap, and he rocked her and he rubbed her back. You want some fresh air? He asked her. Let's get you out of this nasty old air, huh? Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would fly high above the world to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms. Surely so high above the world she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. She wants you too, he said. Jangle, said Sarah Ruth, and she held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth had held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, You got to look for fallen stars. Them are the ones with magic. They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought maybe she had fallen asleep. There, she said, and she pointed out a star streaking across the night sky. Make me a wish, honey, Bryce said, his voice high and tight. That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want. And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. So Edward's in a much better place than on the scarecrow pole, but I don't know. I'm pretty worried about Sarah Ruth. I'm so glad that Edward is there though to make her comfortable. So that's where we're gonna leave off today. We'll come back next week and we'll pick up the story. Thanks for stopping in.